Something is watching how you think, not who you are. Not with eyes, but through patterns, through weakness, through silence, through what you ignore. Have you ever felt drained, confused, off balance, and couldn't explain why? What if the real danger isn't who you see, but what you allow? Tonight, you wake up, the first sign is not loud. It does not announce itself. It does not come with warning. It studies you in silence. You think your life is random. You think your reactions are just how you are. But patterns reveal more than words ever could. And the first thing any manipulative force looks for is emotional instability. Not because you are weak, but because instability creates openings, moments where your guard drops, moments where your decisions are no longer led by clarity, but by reaction. Have you noticed it? Those sudden waves of anger that feel bigger than the situation. Those moments where fear grips you, even when nothing is truly wrong. That heaviness that shows up without invitation, that is not coincidence. Because when your emotions are unguarded, your direction becomes easy to influence. And here is the truth most people ignore. No one gains control over a stable, self-aware mind. Control only enters where confusion lives, where emotions override discipline, where reaction replaces intention. That is the entry point, and it often begins in small, unnoticed ways. A stressful day, a conflict you didn't resolve, a thought you allowed to spiral. You brush it off, you move on. But internally, something shifted. Your clarity weakened. Your emotional ground became unstable. And in that moment, you became easier to steer. Not by force, but by suggestion. Because when emotions rise unchecked, logic steps aside. And when logic steps aside, influence becomes effortless. Think about it. How many decisions have you made that you later regretted? Words spoken in anger, actions taken in fear, choices made in desperation. Those moments were not random. They were moments of vulnerability, moments where your internal defense was lowered. And that is what gets studied, not your strength, your patterns of weakness. Where do you break? Where do you lose control? Where do you doubt yourself? Because once those patterns are clear, influence does not need power. It only needs timing. And timing becomes everything. The right pressure at the wrong moment. The right thought planted when you are already overwhelmed. The right voice when your mind is tired. And suddenly, you are no longer choosing freely. You are reacting. You are following impulses that feel like your own, but are not aligned with your best self. That is how influence works. Quiet, patient, precise. And here is where it gets deeper. Emotional instability is not just about anger or fear. It is also about insecurity, the need for validation, the hunger to be accepted. Because when your identity is uncertain, you begin to look outward for direction. And that is where control becomes even easier. If your worth depends on others, your decisions will too. If your peace depends on circumstances, it can be taken. If your confidence is fragile, it can be manipulated. This is not about fear. This is about awareness. Because once you see it, you cannot be controlled the same way again. You start to notice patterns. You start to pause before reacting. You start to question what you feel instead of immediately obeying it. And that pause is power. That awareness is protection. But here is the challenge. Most people never develop this awareness. They live in reaction mode, constantly responding, rarely reflecting. always moving, but never understanding why. And because of that, they remain predictable. And predictability is what makes influence possible. So, what do? You strengthen your inner state. You stop allowing every emotion to dictate your direction. You build discipline over your reactions. When anger rises, you pause. When fear appears, you question it. When confusion sets in, you do not act immediately. You wait, because clarity always returns to a disciplined mind. And once clarity returns, influence loses its grip. You become harder to steer, harder to shake, harder to control. Because now your decisions are not reactions, they are choices. And that changes everything. This is the first sign. Not what someone else does to you, but what happens within you the moments you lose emotional control, the moments you act without awareness, the moments you drift without direction. That is where influence begins, but it is also where it can end. Because the moment you take control of your internal state, you close the first door, and once that door is closed, everything changes. The second sign is quieter but far more dangerous. It hides behind your thoughts. It sounds like your own voice, but it is not leading you, it is draining you. This is mental fatigue, not just tiredness, not just stress, a slow erosion of your focus, your clarity, your will. Because when your mind is exhausted, resistance disappears. And that is when influence becomes effortless. You wake up already tired, not physically, mentally. Your thoughts feel heavy, your attention drifts. Simple decisions feel overwhelming. You start things and cannot finish them. You think, but nothing feels clear. That is not normal fatigue. That is prolonged mental overload. And here is why it matters. A sharp mind questions everything. An exhausted mind accepts anything. When your mental energy drops, your ability to discern drops with it. You stop analyzing. You stop resisting. You stop filtering what enters your mind. And suddenly everything has access. Every negative thought, every doubt, every external pressure, all of it flows in without resistance because your defenses are down. And here is the truth most people ignore. Mental fatigue is not just caused by work, it is caused by constant input. Too much noise, too many voices, too many opinions, too much information with no space to process it. You scroll endlessly. You consume without pause. You move from one distraction to another, and your mind never resets, never breathes, never clears. So it stays overloaded, and an overloaded mind becomes passive. You begin to accept thoughts without questioning them. You begin to believe feelings without examining them. You begin to act without understanding why. That is the danger, because when your mind stops filtering, anything can take root. Doubt, fear, insecurity, false beliefs. And once those take root, they begin to shape your behavior quietly, gradually, without you noticing. You start to hesitate more. You second guess yourself. You lose confidence in your decisions. You delay action. You avoid challenges. And all of it feels natural. But it is not. It is the result of a mind that has been worn down. And here is where it becomes even more critical. Mental fatigue does not just affect your thoughts, it affects your identity. Because when you are constantly overwhelmed, you forget who you are at your strongest. You forget your clarity. You forget your discipline. You forget your purpose. And in that forgetfulness, you become easier to redirect, not through force, but through suggestion. Because when your internal voice weakens, external influence grows louder, and whatever is loudest begins to lead. That is why protecting your mind is not optional. It is essential because your mind is the gateway. Everything passes through it. Every decision, every reaction, every belief. And if that gateway is unguarded, nothing remains protected. So, what do? You reduce the noise. You become intentional with what you allow into your mind. Not everything deserves your attention. Not every voice deserves your focus. Not every thought deserves your belief. You begin to filter. You choose silence over constant stimulation. You create moments where your mind can reset, where it can breathe, where it can return to clarity. Because clarity is not created through more input, it is created through stillness. And in that stillness, you regain control. You start to think clearly again. You start to see patterns again. You start to recognize what is real and what is not. And that awareness rebuilds your strength. But it does not stop there. You also train your focus. You stop jumping from one distraction to another. You finish what you start. You hold your attention on one thing until it is complete. Because focus is power, and a focused mind cannot be easily influenced. It is steady, it is grounded, it is aware, and awareness blocks manipulation. This is the second sign. Not something external, something internal. The condition of your mind, the level of your clarity, the strength of your focus. If your mind is constantly tired, constantly distracted, constantly overwhelmed, you become easier to influence. But when your mind is sharp, clear, and disciplined, you become untouchable. Because now nothing enters without your permission. Nothing stays without your approval. Nothing controls you without your awareness. And that changes everything. The third sign does not begin in your mind. It begins in your environment, in the people you allow close, in the voices you keep listening to, in the spaces you refuse to leave even when something feels wrong. Because influence rarely works in isolation. It thrives in atmosphere, in repeated exposure, in subtle pressure that builds over time. You may not notice it at first. It feels normal, familiar, even comfortable. But slowly, something shifts. Your energy changes, your thinking changes, your standards begin to lower, and you cannot explain why. That is the danger of the wrong environment. It does not attack you directly. It reshapes you gradually, one conversation at a time, one influence at a time, one compromise at a time. You begin to tolerate what once bothered you. You begin to accept what you once questioned. You begin to align with what you never chose consciously. Because the environment you stay in eventually shapes the person you become. And here is the truth most people avoid. Not every connection is neutral. Some connections drain you. Some confuse you. Some keep you stuck. Not because they are obviously harmful, but because they subtly pull you away from clarity, from discipline, from growth. You leave certain conversations feeling heavier, more doubtful, less confident, but you ignore it. You tell yourself it is nothing. You convince yourself it will pass, but it does not. Because repeated exposure turns moments into patterns, and patterns turn into identity. You start thinking like the people around you. You start speaking like them. You start making decisions based on their perspective, not your own. And eventually, you lose your original direction. Not all at once, but slowly, silently. And here is where it becomes critical. The wrong environment creates internal conflict. You feel pulled in two directions. One part of you wants growth, another part of you feels comfortable staying the same. One part of you seeks clarity, another part accepts confusion, and that internal conflict drains your strength because you are constantly divided, constantly unsure, constantly adjusting. And in that division, you become easier to influence because a divided mind cannot stand firm. It wavers, it hesitates, it looks outward for direction. And that is where control becomes possible. Again, not through force, but through influence, through suggestion, through repeated exposure to ideas that slowly reshape your thinking. That is why environment is not just about where you are. It is about what you are absorbing every single day. The conversations, the attitudes, the beliefs, the energy, all of it enters you. All of it leaves a mark. And over time, it defines your direction. So what do? You become selective. Not everyone deserves access to your space. Not every voice deserves a place in your mind. You start paying attention to how you feel after interactions. Do you feel stronger or weaker, clearer or more confused, focused or distracted? Those signals matter because your internal state never lies. It reveals what is affecting you, even when your mind tries to ignore it. And once you see it, you must act. You create distance where needed. You set boundaries where necessary. You remove yourself from environments that pull you away from who you are becoming, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Because protecting your environment protects your direction, and it goes deeper. You do not just remove negative influence, you replace it with strength. You surround yourself with clarity, with discipline, with people and spaces that challenge you to grow, not stay stagnant. Because the right environment does the opposite. It sharpens you, it strengthens you, it aligns you. It reminds you of your purpose instead of pulling you away from it. And when you are in the right environment, influence loses its power. Because now everything around you reinforces your strength, not your weakness. This is the third sign. Not something dramatic, something subtle. The influence of your environment, the impact of your connections, the effect of repeated exposure. If your environment weakens you, you become easier to influence. But if your environment strengthens you, you become harder to move, harder to shake, harder to control, because now you are aligned internally and externally. And alignment creates stability, and stability blocks influence. And once that happens, everything changes. The fourth sign is the most overlooked and the most dangerous because it feels harmless, it feels normal, it feels like something you can ignore. But this is where everything either stands or collapses. This is the absence of boundaries, not physical boundaries, internal ones. The lines you refuse to let anyone cross, the standards you refuse to lower, the values you refuse to compromise. Because without boundaries, everything has access. Your time, your energy, your attention, your decisions, And when everything has access, nothing is protected. You say yes when you should say no. You allow behavior that you know is wrong. You tolerate disrespect to avoid conflict. You stay silent when you should speak. You ignore your instincts just to keep peace. And slowly, you lose control over your own life. Not because someone forced you, but because you never defined your limits. And here is the truth most people struggle to accept. If you do not set boundaries, others will set them for you. And those boundaries will never serve your growth. They will serve convenience. They will serve control. They will serve comfort, but not your purpose. Because people will take what you do not protect, not always intentionally, but consistently. And every time you allow it, it becomes easier for them to do it again. That is how patterns are formed. That is how control is established. Not in one moment, but in repeated permission. You teach people how to treat you by what you tolerate. And if you tolerate everything, you invite anything. That is the danger. Because once boundaries disappear, influence becomes constant. You begin to act based on pressure, on expectations, on avoiding discomfort, instead of acting from clarity, from strength, from purpose. You lose your voice. You lose your direction. You lose your authority over your own decisions. And it does not happen suddenly. It happens gradually, one small compromise at a time. You let something slide. You ignore a feeling. You avoid confrontation. You convince yourself it is not worth addressing. But each time you do that, your boundaries weaken. And weakened boundaries invite more pressure, more intrusion, more influence, until one day you realize you are no longer in control. You are reacting, adjusting, accommodating, but not leading your own life. That is the consequence of unprotected boundaries. But here is where everything shifts. The moment you decide enough, the moment you become clear about what you allow and what you do not, the moment you stop negotiating your standards, that is where control returns. And it starts with awareness. You identify where your boundaries have been crossed, where you have been silent, where you have been passive, where you have allowed things that do not align with who you are, and you stop ignoring it. You face it directly, because awareness without action changes nothing. Then you begin to speak clearly, firmly, without apology. You say no when necessary. You express what you will not accept. You stand your ground even when it is uncomfortable, because discomfort is temporary, but loss of control becomes permanent if ignored. And here is the key. Boundaries are not about pushing people away. They are about protecting what matters. Your focus, your energy, your direction, your peace. And when those are protected, your strength increases. Your clarity sharpens. Your decisions become intentional. And influence loses its power. Because now access is limited. Not everything gets in. Not everything stays. Not everything affects you. You become selective. You become aware. You become grounded. And grounded people cannot be easily moved. They know who they are. They know what they stand for. They know what they will not tolerate. And that certainty creates resistance, strong resistance, the kind that stops manipulation before it even begins. This is the fourth sign, not something external, something deeply personal. Your boundaries, your standards, your limits If they are weak, influence enters freely. But if they are strong, nothing crosses without your permission. And that changes everything. Because now you are no longer reacting. You are deciding. You are no longer adjusting. You are leading. You are no longer influenced. You are in control. Now you see it. Not fear, but awareness. Not weakness, but responsibility. You are not exposed, you are awakened. Nothing controls you unless you surrender it. Stand firm. Guard your mind, your environment, your boundaries. And from this moment forward, you take back everything.